Good day. There's been quite a few interesting developments in the conflict between Russia and the Western powers, which centers on Ukraine. But before going into all of the details, I will do what I traditionally now do, which is talk about the situation on the battlefronts. Now, the big event this morning and last night was another massive succession of missile and drone strikes by the Russians across Ukraine, principally targeting Ukraine's energy system. Now, this has become a very interesting pattern. What happens is that every couple of days we get these massive strikes. There's then a brief lull of a day or so as the Ukrainians struggle to get the system back up in running order, which they, by the way, generally manage to do. And then as soon as things start to stabilize or begin to look better in terms of the generation of electricity by Ukraine, another massive series of strikes, missile and drone strikes like the ones we've seen over the course of last night and this morning take place. And this, it seems to me, is exactly consistent with what John Helmer was saying a short time ago, a couple of weeks ago, when these missile strikes first began on his website, Dancing with Bears, which is that the Russians are gradually getting an increasing understanding of the Ukrainian energy system. They're playing cat and mouse with the Ukrainians. They launch their strikes, they see what the Ukrainians do, they get a better sense of the vulnerabilities of the system. They get a better sense of what steps Ukraine is going to try to take in response to the attacks on the system. And then they launch a further series of strikes after they've seen what the Ukrainians are going to do. And steadily, the pace of this, I suspect, along these lines, is going to continue for week after week, month perhaps after month, until eventually the Russians know enough about the system and its vulnerabilities that they're prepared that they're in a position to launch an all-out attack against it. And I suspect that the primary purpose of this attack, when it comes, will be twofold. Firstly, it will be to interrupt Ukrainian communications, transport and communications, obviously telephone, all that kind of thing, internet, but also critically the railway system upon which Ukraine depends to move troops from one battlefront to another and from the reserve positions and to transport equipment. Most of the Ukrainian railway system operates on electric traction. There are some diesel locomotives in Ukraine, but they're apparently few in number. And because of the difference in gauge, they cannot, these diesel locomotives, diesel electric locomotives cannot be supplemented with supplies of locomotives from the West. Ukraine uses Russian gauge, which is different from that in Western Europe, and so the Western countries cannot donate diesel electric locomotives to Ukraine to get its trains operating. So the fact that Ukraine principally uses electric traction, electric locomotives, the fact that the electricity system is going to start to break down will affect Ukraine's ability, as I said, to move troops and supplies around when the big Russian offensive comes. I think that is the primary purpose of this offensive. I don't think it's intended to cause hardship to the population. That may be a consequence, but I don't think that is the intention. I don't think anybody in Moscow believes that if the life of people in Ukraine is made harder, that will somehow turn them against the Ukrainian government. I think instead it has a very practical and very specific purpose, which is to affect Ukraine's ability to move troops and supplies around the battlefronts at the time when the Russian offensive is going to come. And of course, if trains stop or are stopped in railway sidings or railway stations, then of course they also become targets. They become easier targets. It's obviously, logically, it's an easier thing to do to target a stationary train rather than a moving train. And that would also enable the Russians to take action to destroy more of Ukraine's railway system, rolling stock, making the difficulty of moving men and equipment around even more difficult. And it's quite clear that neither Ukraine nor the Western powers have any real response to this other than keep their fingers crossed and hope that the endless rumours, claims, reports, guesses that the Russians are running out of cruise missiles are true. There's no sign of that at the moment. The Deputy Chair of Russia's Defense Council and former Prime Minister and President Dmitry Medvedev ridiculed the suggestion that Russia is running short of military equipment. Who knows what the truth is, but for the moment at least, it doesn't seem as if the Russians are in fact running out of missiles. And it's probably the case that the Western powers are not really in a position to help Ukraine counter the attack of these missiles. What the events of the last few weeks have exposed once again is how critically short the Western powers are of effective air defense systems. Certainly they don't seem to have any comparable in effectiveness to those which the Russians use. So there's been 2 short-range point defense infrared-based systems provided by Germany, which have never been tested. They've never been operated even by the German military. And the specifications suggest the capabilities, the announced capabilities of these systems strongly suggest that they're not up to the level of countering these cruise missile and drone attacks with any degree of effectiveness. And besides, even if they were, there's not going to be anywhere near enough to do that. Now, the US is also sending 2 of its US Norwegian designed systems, which appear to be based on the AMRAAM air-to-air system, if I've understood this correctly. If I'm wrong about that, people can correct me. Again, only 2 systems, or perhaps 4, are going to be provided, nowhere near enough to cover the battlefields. And as others, for example, Brian Beletic at the New Atlas, have pointed out, these systems anyway seem to be inferior to the Ukrainian S-300 missile system, a legacy system left to Ukraine by the Soviet Union, which seems to be altogether more effective than either of these 2 systems that I've just mentioned. And France is going to send Crotale systems, which have their origins in the 1970s and which again don't really look to me to be remotely up to the task of dealing with threats of a kind that the Crotale back in the 1970s wasn't designed to deal with because they didn't exist in that time. And the same is true of the Hawk anti-aircraft missile system that the United States is apparently now mulling also supplying, which originally dates from 1959. It was updated in the 1970s. It was phased out of the US military in the mid-1990s. I understand that the US Marine Corps used it a bit longer until it was eventually replaced by, of all things, the Stinger handheld anti-aircraft system. Again, however updated the Hawk is, it's an old system, it's inherently an old system, and it clearly wasn't designed to deal with the kind of missile and drone threats that Ukraine is facing now. In fact, it's debatable whether any Western system really is up to this task. Probably the one that is most likely to be is the US Patriot system, much more sophisticated than any of the ones we're talking about. People who know about such things say that it's roughly at the same level of sophistication as the S-300s currently used by Ukraine, though it may have been left behind by the S-400s and S-500s that are now being fielded by Russia. Regardless, it would take a huge amount of time for the Ukrainians to be trained to use Patriot systems. The US has been reluctant to field these systems in Ukraine, to supply these kind of systems to Ukraine. And to be honest, I doubt that they would be very effective against this kind of threat either. Everyone accepts that no air defense system that the West is able to provide Ukraine, and it seems that this can only be done in relatively limited numbers anyway, that no system, air defense system that the West can supply to Ukraine can intercept the Kinzhal hypersonic air-to-ground missiles which Russia fields and which operate from its MiG-31 ultra-high-speed fighter bomber jets. So again, there's lots of stories that Russia has had to stop production of the Kinzhal system because supposedly it's running out of microprocessors, the kind of advanced microprocessors that are the Kinzhal needs. I have to say straight away that I don't think that is true. I'm sure that the Russians are able to get hold of whatever microprocessors they need. And on this topic, I get to repeat something I've said some months ago, which I still hold to. My understanding is that some years ago, quite a long time ago, about 5, 6, 7 years ago, the Russian military decided that its top-end weapon systems should use Russian-designed and built microprocessors, and that these are purpose-built for these systems now by Russia's Rostec corporation. This is outside the main civilian Russian semiconductor industry that people hear and talk so much about, and about which you can find so many YouTube videos. The reason some Russian weapon systems, like the Armata tank and some of Russia's advanced drones, have taken so long to appear on the battlefields is that the Russian military insisted that they had to use Russian-designed and built chips, and it has taken Rostec some time to develop and build chips of the necessary sophistication. However, that presumably has been done. The Russians obviously are now fielding hypersonic missiles to an increasing degree, not just the Kinzhal, but systems like the Zircon, which is obviously ship-based, and that points to microprocessors being built in sufficient quantities to make it possible to build and operate these systems. This is not obviously done on the industrial scale that you get in Taiwan and probably before long in China, but it is probably sufficient for the Russian military's purposes. So that's what I have heard. I can't confirm it's true. How can anyone? But it's what I have heard, what I have seen, and it is what I personally think is probably the case. Anyway, putting all that aside, the Russians do possess a stock of hypersonic systems, Kinjal and the rest. We don't know how large it is, and this is true regardless of whether or not they make these high-end chips. I'm not suggesting, by the way, that they're as high-end as those that are made in Taiwan or South Korea or come anywhere close. All I'm saying is that they're high-end enough for this purpose. And anyway, putting that aside, the Russians do possess a stock of Kinjal missiles. I suspect that there would be more than enough to deal with any air defense system that the Western powers supply to Ukraine if there was any need to attack that system with hypersonic missiles. And, well, we will see whether that ever happens. But anyway, for the moment, it doesn't look as if the Western powers have the means to help Ukraine with these problems. There was a report, by the way, that Israel is going to provide some advice and technology to Ukraine to help it deal with drones, Israel having had to deal with drones many times. What I've seen of this Israeli technology suggests to me, again, that it is too complex for Ukraine to use and probably far from foolproof, and would almost certainly be overwhelmed by these Russian missile attacks. Now, I've gone into more detail over this than I perhaps feel comfortable doing. Like so much else, this is not an area of my particular expertise. I'm only talking about things that I have heard and seen reported and which I believe to be true. Events may turn otherwise, but I don't think anybody seriously questions that the Western powers have neglected development of surface-to-air missile defenses because they have relied excessively on assumptions of air superiority because of the size of their air forces, and that has now put them in a position where they're going to struggle to meet Ukraine's needs in order to resist this Russian missile offensive that we're seeing underway now. So that's all I want to say about that. I think, as I said, we're going to see this game of cat and mouse with Ukraine, which Russia is playing, continue until the moment comes when we will get this big attack with hundreds of missiles and drones all at the same time, launched in such a way that the entire system is overwhelmed, probably for a few days, enabling the Russians to conduct the offensive operations that they wish. I would add, by the way, and in parenthesis, that Ukraine now says that around 40% of its energy system is inoperative, and blackouts now are becoming an increasingly regular occurrence in Ukrainian cities. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say about that. Anybody who knows differently or has other views about all of this and some of the things I've just said is welcome to set it out in the threads to this video. Now, on the battlefields, it seems to me that we're looking now at a situation where one can start to say that the Ukrainian offensive has, to all intents and purposes, if not exactly ended, it is perhaps now reaching or coming close to reaching its end point. Now, there's been an article in Reuters, the British news agency, which consistently likes to take the view that takes the most optimistic view possible of the situation for Ukraine, but it seems to me that even Reuters is starting to acknowledge that the military situation for Ukraine is starting to look less good. Now, let's turn first to a discussion of the Kherson situation. And we see that Reuters is now acknowledging that the Ukrainian offensive, has slowed down in Kherson region. There was an article about this in Reuters, which I noticed Reuters has just taken down. But anyway, the thrust of the article was that Russian artillery in Kherson region is now operating with increasing intensity, that the Russians have reinforced heavily in Kherson region, that they've set up sophisticated supply lines, and that Ukraine is now having real problems continuing with this offensive. And I think that is almost certainly, by the way, the truth. That is how it looks to me. And in fact, I'm going to go further. I'm going to say that, in my opinion, the Kherson offensive has probably, for the moment at least, Ukraine's Kherson offensive has, for the moment at least, stalled. And it's possible, in fact, that with the build-up of Russian forces in Kherson region, we might even start to see a Russian counter-offensive in Kherson region before very long. Now, I mentioned an article by Reuters, which, as I said, Reuters appears to have taken down, which somewhat concedes that the Kherson offensive has now essentially run out of steam. But it is also the case that the Russian news agency TASS, is now also writing about the situation in Kherson region, and it's doing so taking this as an interview from the Russian-appointed governor of Kherson region, Vladimir Saldo. Now, I'm going to be reading a number of articles by TASS containing reports from certain Russian officials about the situation on the battlefronts in this video. I want to make it clear, first of all, that these are Russian articles and that these are Russian officials. And I'm not saying that what these officials are saying is necessarily the truth or even the whole truth. They may be giving an over-optimistic spin on events, and it's quite likely that they are. However, I am going to read these articles because it seems to me that these articles do point to one thing, which is growing Russian confidence. They suggest that the Russians themselves now believe that they have the situation across all of the battlefronts under control, and that the initiative on the battlefronts is now returning to them as their military forces build up, and with his new commander Surovikin in charge, and that Ukraine is now once more losing the initiative and will shortly be pushed once more back onto the defensive. So let's start with the article about Kherson region, and it's entitled "Situation in Kherson area is stabilizing," and then it refers to what Vladimir Saldo, the acting governor, I should make it clear, Russian-appointed acting governor of Kherson region, is saying. He says, or rather he's reported as saying, by TASS, the situation in the Kherson area is stabilizing, artillery bombardments are less frequent, and the Ukrainian forces make no attempts to counterattack. The Kherson region's acting governor, Vladimir Saldo, said on the Rossiya 24 round-the-clock television news channel on Thursday. For now, there are no serious changes or counterattacks or anything else on the line of engagement. There are far fewer shellings than usual or than 10 days ago. In general, the situation looks stable. And then he went on to say that the civilian panel of the region's administration was assisting the military in terms of logistics so that the armed forces feel sufficient support. And that, of course, closely corresponds to that now deleted Reuters report, looking at things from the other side of the fence, from what the Ukrainians are saying. They too are talking about strengthening Russian defenses in Kherson region, more and more Russian troops in Kherson region, more and more confidence on the part of the Russian military in Kherson region. And, by the way, saying that the Russian artillery strikes on the Ukrainians are increasing, even as Saldo, the acting Russian governor of Kherson region, says that Ukrainian artillery strikes on Russian positions are decreasing. So that gives us a sense that perhaps the situation, the balance in Kherson region is starting to shift back in the Russians' favor. And so that's one report that I'm going to mention. I would just say that I've been reading in Russian mainstream media something else about Kherson region, which is that the evacuation of civilians from Kherson city has all but come to a stop, that most people in Kherson city apparently showed no desire or wish to leave. Now, it's possible that that's because many of them actually want the Ukrainians to come and liberate them from the Russians. I've always said that I have felt that there's more pro-Ukrainian sentiment in Kherson than there is in other areas, that in the other areas which Russia has now incorporated into Russia itself. But it is more likely, or so it seems to me, that the reason that most people are choosing to stay in Kherson city is because, as Saldo says, the situation in Kherson city is indeed stabilizing, and the population, the local population, therefore no longer feels the need to go. Now, could be that everything's going to change, that Ukraine is going to throw more forces into the battle despite the deteriorating weather conditions that Mr. Reznikov, the Ukrainian defense minister, is talking about. But for the moment, as I said, the pendulum seems to be shifting back in Russia's favor in Kherson region. And we have other reports now, also from TASS. And firstly, I'm going to deal with one about the situation in Bakhmut city in Donetsk region. Now, this is where what I believe to be the biggest single battle by far that is taking place in Ukraine at the moment is actually going on. It's not been widely reported in the Western media because Ukraine is clearly on the defensive here. I would, before I proceed in discussing this article, just explain that the Russians refer to Bakhmut by its previous Soviet name, which was Artyomovsk. Now, if the Russians do take control of Bakhmut city, following my practice, I will no doubt also start to refer to it as Artyomovsk. But for the moment, I'm going to continue to call it Bakhmut. But this article by TASS refers to that city as Artyomovsk, and I just wanted to make that clear. And let me repeat again, I'm not reading out this article, which is by TASS and which quotes Russian officials. as telling us necessarily the truth or the full truth about what is actually happening in Bakhmut city. But it does give a sense, or so it seems to me, of growing confidence. And that's why I'm reading this article, because it's that growing Russian confidence which I want to convey. Anyway, the article reads, liberating Artyomovsk, which is to say, of course, Bakhmut, to help take the northern Donetsk region under control, says Donetsk leader. And earlier, the Lugansk People's Republic militia officer Andrei Marochko said that Allied forces, that's to say the Russian military, the Wagner organization, and the Donbass militia, had been steadily advancing, pushing the adversary, that means the Ukrainian army, to northwestern Artyomovsk. So that would imply that the Ukrainians are in retreat within Artyomovsk. Now, let me repeat again, that may be true, that may not be true. That's not the reason I'm reading this article, but it does give a sense of the direction, the sense of confidence, as I said, that the Russians are feeling. And the article goes on to say the liberation, what the Russians, of course, would call it, the liberation of Artyomovsk, called Bakhmut by the Kiev regime, will help take control over Kramatorsk, which will facilitate the advancement in the north of the Donetsk People's Republic. Acting Donetsk head Denis Pushilin told Soloviev Live TV channel on Thursday. They have a rather serious Slavyansk-Artyomovsk-Kramatorsk fortification line. If Artyomovsk is liberated, this will be a very serious blow to the adversary. This is, of course, Pushilin's words. The pathways used to deliver munitions and reinforcements will be disrupted. These links will be severed, and this will create a rather convenient situation for the liberation of populated localities, and in particular Kramatorsk. On the Kramatorsk front, we can attain success and move on to directly clearing the north of the Republic, Pushilin elaborated. And then again, we're reminded that Andrei Marochko, the Lugansk militia leader, told TASS that Allied forces had been steadily advancing, pushing the adversary to northwest Artyomovsk, and that the situation obviously is getting more difficult for Ukraine there. So that's what that article in TASS says. And now we've also had another article, also from TASS, about a successful counteroffensive that has been launched in the Liman area. Now that's Krasny Liman, the town that was captured by Ukraine at the end of September, and or was it the beginning of October? I can't exactly remember now, but which was perhaps the high point, the highest point that the Ukrainian offensive, which was launched firstly against the town of Balaklia in September in Kharkiv region, and then which captured Izium and Kupiansk. Its furthest extent, its last important victory, was the capture of what the Russians called Krasny Liman and what the Ukrainians call Liman. And this article from TASS says the Allied forces in the Krasny Liman area already have an opportunity to go on the offensive and dislodge Ukrainian militants. Russians always refer to Ukrainian troops as militants because they don't want to give too much legitimacy to the Ukrainian army. From Makeyevka and Novosadovaya, the acting head of the Donetsk People's Republic, Denis Pushilin, said on Soloviev Live TV on Thursday. Take the Krasny Liman area, the situation is changing fast there. The 20th Army, that is, by the way, a regular army, a regular unit, a regular formation, or rather group of formations, army group of the Russian regular military, has repelled enemy attacks for several days in a row. That, by the way, is true. There's been lots of reports about Ukrainian attacks in this area, specifically attacks towards the towns of Svatovo and Kremenaya, or rather perhaps I should say large village in the case of Kremenaya, and with attempts by Ukraine to break into Lugansk region, all of which have been unsuccessful. Anyway, to continue, what Pushilin says, now it is possible to go on the counteroffensive and drive the enemy out of Makeyevka. And in fact, I've heard that the Russians have indeed captured Makeyevka and in the Krasny Liman district and Novosadovaya. And there's been this article from TASS hints that the recapture by the Russian army of Krasny Liman may not be so far off. So these are 3 articles from TASS, all in today's, published by TASS today, all of which might lead you to think that the mood amongst the Russians is becoming increasingly confident, that they feel that the initiative on the battlefields is reverting to them. And I suspect that is true. We're probably seeing the gradual exhaustion of the Ukrainian counteroffensive. The Ukrainians have been on the offensive, or trying to maintain the offensive, since the end of August. Its high point came at the end of September, early part of October, with, as I said, the capture of Liman and the push in Kherson region of an armoured column which reached to the village of Duchany on the west bank of the Dnieper River. But ever since then, the front lines have been essentially at a standstill, except in Bakhmut city, where the Russians appear to be advancing ever so slowly, ever so incrementally, but ever so effectively. And it seems that as the Ukrainians get weaker, having suffered heavy losses, both in men and materials, the Russians increasingly benefiting from the call-up of reservists as part of the mobilization that Putin ordered on the 21st of September, and with more weapon systems being sent to their military, and with their new commander, General Surovikin, in overall charge, the Russians are starting to feel that the Ukrainian offensive has run its course, and that the initiative on the battlefields is starting to shift towards them. Now, that may be true, or it may not be true. What I will say is this: if it is true, and I have to say the indications, as far as I can see, point that way, then the overall conclusion about the Ukrainian offensive that was launched at the end of August must be that it has been a strategic failure. It has failed to capture any really important place. It hasn't captured Kherson city. It hasn't recaptured Lysychansk. It hasn't managed it hasn't broken through to Melitopol and cut the Russian supply lines to Kherson. So far, it hasn't recaptured the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. So the actual geographical targets of any Ukrainian offensive have not been achieved. And on top of that, Ukraine has failed to encircle or destroy any Russian military formation, or even deal, so far as I can see, any really severe losses upon Russian troops. The Russians, again, as Brian Boletic at the New Atlas has said, they've invariably sidestepped any Ukrainian attempts to encircle them. They've pulled back when it's looks like they might be encircled. They've kept their forces intact, and of course their forces are now reinforcing. By contrast, Ukraine has suffered very heavy losses. We don't know how heavy because the Ukrainians don't give us casualty figures, but all the indications are that they are very heavy, and their stock of weapons supplied by the West has diminished. And so if it is the case that the offensive has run its course, then, as I said, it must be considered a strategic failure. Not just a strategic failure for Ukraine, by the way. If it is also true that the rumors and stories that one hears, principally it must be said in the Ukrainian and Russian media, that the Biden administration was pushing Ukraine to achieve some big victory before the 8th November midterms in the United States are true, then the Biden administration has also failed in that objective. It's looking increasingly unlikely, as of the time of making of this video, that there's going to be that big Ukrainian victory before the midterms. I doubt, by the way, it would have made any real difference in the outcome of the midterms, but I can perhaps understand why people in the administration, looking at an increasingly bleak electoral picture, might have hoped otherwise. So that's where we are, a complex situation, one not entirely easy to read, but I do feel that the tactics, the strategy Surovikin outlined in his interview given about 10 days ago now, that the Russians would strengthen their lines and build up their reserves, and at the same time conduct a war of attrition against the Ukrainians, that's the strategy that has been followed by the Russians over the last few weeks since Surovikin's appointment, and it seems for the moment, so far as I can see, to be paying off. Anyway, that's the situation on the battlefields. As I said, there's an awful lot more going on, and I'm going to touch on three further things. The first is, of course, the nuclear exercise that the Russians have just conducted, with Putin himself as supreme commander of the Russian armed forces, supervising it from his headquarters in Moscow. Now, just to remind everyone again, Russia has the largest nuclear arsenal of any country, greater than that of the United States. And as Putin has himself pointed out, some of these weapon systems, missiles, things that Russia possesses are more advanced and more modern than those of the United States. And of course, the Russians have a whole stream of new systems like the Sarmat system, for example, enormously powerful intercontinental ballistic missile coming online fairly soon. And earlier, just a few weeks ago, we learnt that a very powerful, very large Russian submarine, the Belgorod, is now deployed in the Arctic. And there are again rumors that it may be testing Russia's Status 6 or Poseidon nuclear-powered underwater drone, a true doomsday weapon, in my opinion. I did a video about it about more than a year ago now, perhaps significantly more than a year ago, pointing out what a terrifying weapon and what an inherently destabilizing weapon it is. But anyway, all of these systems are coming online, supplementing Russia's existing nuclear arsenal, which is intimidating enough. Now, the Russians do regularly carry out exercises of their nuclear forces, and in a sense, this is easily understood as another routine exercise. But it's perhaps worth pointing out that this exercise is the second that has taken place this year. There was another one in February, around the time when the special military operation was launched. On that occasion, as I well remember, Putin was joined by Lukashenko, the president of Belarus, in his command headquarters. So this is the second time in a year that the Russians have conducted such an exercise. And that, I think, is unusual. And I think that is intended as a warning to the United States, first and foremost. And it's not surprising, perhaps, because, of course, we've had all these wild talk for months, which the Russians repeatedly deny, about the Russians planning to use tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine, which the Russians, I think, have been generally unsettled by and have come increasingly to see as orchestrated, perhaps in order to justify some sort of US military response. We've also been told by the Russians themselves that they've received a whole series of private warnings from the United States. And not just the Russians, the Americans have also told us that the United States has been relaying private warnings to Russia about dramatic consequences if Russia uses nuclear weapons in Ukraine, something which the Russians have always said they have no intention of doing. And given that the Russians have no such intention of using tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine, as I pointed out in another video, it's almost certain that the Russians see these warnings not so much as warnings, but rather as threats. And of course, Russian officials, including President Putin himself, have all but said as much. And yesterday, overnight, I got a report from someone in Finland who spoke about the fact that the Finnish media is now apparently discussing possible deployment of US nuclear weapons in Finland. In other words, very, very close to Russia's borders. And all of this is happening even as there's been more reports that the United States is sending tactical nuclear weapons, more tactical nuclear weapons, bombs and that sort of thing to Europe as well. The Pentagon insists that this is unrelated to the events in Ukraine, that these are just replacing older systems with newer ones. But of course it is something which the Russians might see differently. And of course we've had all of this talk in recent days coming from the Russians about Ukraine perhaps considering developing and deploying and using a dirty bomb, a conventional device which, however, is designed to spread radioactive material, causing radioactive fallout, which could be extremely devastating for civilians. Anyway, all of this taken together perhaps explains why the Russians are engaging in this nuclear exercise at this time. I think it is a warning to the United States, in particular to the US administration. Don't push us. Remember, we are a nuclear power, just as you are. If you try to push us too far, the consequences could be catastrophic, not just for us, but perhaps equally for you. And I think that this is what this is basically all about. So that is alarming in itself. The Russians have tried to play down these nuclear drills, but as I said, they are the second set of nuclear drills that the Russians have conducted this year. And I think that they are indeed intended to send a message. I have to say that speaking for myself, I have never been more concerned that we are in a very dangerous situation where nuclear weapons are concerned. I've never known a time in my lifetime, I don't remember the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. I have never known a time in my lifetime where the use of nuclear weapons at a time of international crisis has been so actively discussed. And I find it most unnerving and very alarming. And I do hope that if it is a warning from the Russians, that this is heeded and that any wild ideas that anybody may have in Washington and indeed in Moscow is heeded, that this warning is heeded, and that people start to dial this incessant talk about nuclear weapons down. I think that simply talking about this subject already lowers the threshold and weakens the taboo against their use. Anyway, that's what I wanted to say about that. Now, the other thing is that we've now had the Russians giving warnings that they might take action against satellites. And this has come from Konstantin Vorontsov, a senior Russian foreign ministry official, and he actually gave this warning to commercial satellite providers. He said that the use of Western satellites to aid the Ukrainian war effort was an extremely dangerous trend. Quasi-civilian infrastructure may be a legitimate target for a retaliatory strike, he told the United Nations First Committee, adding that the West's use of such satellites to support Ukraine was provocative. We are talking about the involvement of components of civilian space infrastructure, including commercial, by the US and its allies in armed conflicts, Vorontsov said. I should say I'm reading this from Reuters. Vorontsov did not mention any specific satellite companies, though Elon Musk said earlier this month that his rocket company SpaceX would continue to fund its Starlink's internet service in Ukraine, citing the need for good deeds. And Reuters then reminds us that Russia has a significant offensive space capability, as do the United States and China. In 2021, Russia launched an anti-satellite missile to destroy one of its own satellites. So can I just say, if you take your mind back to a video I did, I think about a week ago, in which I discussed Elon Musk's various comments and the fact that there's been interruptions in the operation of the Starlink system, upon which Ukraine is heavily dependent for its communications. I said that the evidence that I saw, though not conclusive, pointed to Russian success in jamming the signals of the Starlink system. And by the way, I understand that an American university has carried out a test of the system and has found that it is indeed capable of being jammed. So I think that what Vorontsov is actually talking about, what he's actually doing, is not suggesting that the Russians are going to start shooting down satellites, though they certainly do possess the capability to do that, and they might, for all I know, do it. What he is doing is he's giving a public warning to Elon Musk. He's saying, look, we know what you're up to. We know what's been going on. Not just Elon Musk, of course, but the US. We know what you're up to. Don't think that because you're pretending that your Starlink system is civilian, that we don't know that it's not being put to a military use and that it is not in itself a military target. We've shown that we can jam this system, and if you persist in using it, we will go on jamming it, and we might not just jam parts of the system, we could conceivably jam all of it, rendering it all inoperable. And that, I think, is a message that Musk has perhaps already received indirectly in some way. And as I discussed in my previous video, I think it explains his wobble over providing Starlink services to Ukraine, and it also perhaps explains why he floated that peace proposal. So you can see that the Russians are turning the screw on the US, on Elon Musk. They're saying, you know, all right, you've been able to do this up to now. Don't think you can get away with this for much longer. Don't push your luck here. So we'll see how Elon Musk and the US authorities respond to that. Now, there's been one other thing I want to touch on, which is a long article in the Daily Telegraph about Sergei Kiriyenko, who is now Putin's representative in the four regions. And the Daily Telegraph did a long piece suggesting that Kiriyenko might be Putin's eventual successor. I'm going to say this, I don't believe that is the case, actually. I think this is a misreading of the situation. I think there's compelling reasons why Kiriyenko probably will not be Putin's successor, but he is an interesting man, and I do want to say a few things about him. Now, Kiriyenko comes from communist royalty. His grandfather was a prominent Bolshevik fighter during the period of the Russian Revolution and Civil War, and he was actually personally decorated by no less a person than Vladimir Lenin. And Kiriyenko, who was born in Sukhumi, which is, by the way, in Abkhazia, technically an independent republic, but a breakaway region of Georgia under Russian protection. But anyway, Kiriyenko had, in his early years, an interesting career in the Komsomol, the Communist Party's youth organization, and also in Nizhny Novgorod, which is an important city on the Volga, which is the base for a large part of Russia's military-industrial complex. And he seems to have been had some kind of management role for a time at the very interesting Krasnoye Sormovo shipyard in Nizhny Novgorod. Nizhny Novgorod is an inland city. It's very far inland, but it is located on the Volga River. And it has this very strange, very remarkable shipyard, which, amongst other things, builds diesel-electric submarines for first the Soviet and then the Russian Navy. They're built far inland in this plant, and then they're sent down the river, down the Volga River, to whatever Russia has this extraordinary river system with all these complex system of canals that link it up. They're built at Krasnoye Sormovo, and they're sent all the way to the various fleets, the Russian fleets. And it's been quite an interesting plant. It's apparently not been very active in recent years, but it has apparently been revived. And it's also, by the way, started to build some rather interesting submarines, rather small submarines, but some of them apparently do have nuclear reactors. So Kiriyenko worked as a young man in this plant, very much part of the Soviet military-industrial complex. And then, as happens, Soviet Union collapsed. Nizhny Novgorod became the power base of a prominent Russian liberal politician, Boris Nemtsov. Boris Nemtsov got to know Kiriyenko and suggested him to Boris Yeltsin, the then Russian president, as a possible prime minister. And in March 1998, Kiriyenko was catapulted to the post of prime minister of Russia, where he was universally assumed to be an ardent liberal reformer. Now, I am since have reasons to doubt that he was ever actually quite as liberal or as much of a reformer as many assumed at the time. His career seems to me to have had some similarities to that of Putin himself. Putin came from Leningrad and then St. Petersburg. He was again spotted by the mayor of St. Petersburg, Anatoly Sobchak, who was a prominent liberal, and just as Nemtsov sponsored Kiriyenko's career, so Sobchak sponsored Putin's career. So they seem to me to have followed similar tracks. It doesn't follow that deep down they ever were very convinced liberals. Anyway, Kiriyenko became prime minister in what was supposed to be a reformist government. It became very clear very quickly that he was actually simply a placeholder. The real power lay elsewhere. And when the financial crisis hit Russia in 1998 and the ruble was massively devalued, Kiriyenko was sacked in circumstances that appear to have caused him a great deal of distress. Anyway, regardless of that, he was scapegoated for the whole crisis, which is grossly unfair. And for a time, he continued to follow Nemtsov. He became involved in a Russian Liberal Party, but very quickly he was plucked up by Putin, who had just become Russian president, and Putin made him his representative in the Volga Federal District, which, by the way, includes Nizhny Novgorod and the Krasnoye Sormovo plant and all the other big military industrial facilities there. And Kiriyenko continued in that role until 2005, when Putin promoted him, made him head of Rosatom, the giant Russian corporation that runs Russia's civilian nuclear program, but which importantly also makes Russia's nuclear weapons. So Kiriyenko, who retained his position as head of Rosatom until 2017, and who comes across to me less as a liberal and more as an important technocrat and manager within Russia's military industrial complex. By all accounts, he was an outstandingly successful manager of Rosatom, and Putin subsequently appointed him his deputy chief of staff. So he's very close to Putin himself. And Putin has now sent Kiriyenko to supervise the administration of these four regions. Now, I'm not convinced that Kiriyenko is indeed being singled out for promotion to the position of eventual successor to Putin. I think he's still associated with too many people's eyes in Russia with that disastrous liberal experiment in the 1990s. But as I said, he is an interesting man. He has roots in the military-industrial complex. He has a potential power base in Rosatom, which has vast numbers of technocrats it can call on. He clearly will have had very close connections with the Russian military. He is an interesting man to watch, and of course he's now been given this role of supervising the admission, the incorporation of these four regions into Russia. As I said, I still doubt that he's going to become Russia's next president, though you never know. But I thought I'd just say a few things about him. Different things, I think, from some of the things that you will be reading in the West. So I've gone on for more than an hour, but as I said, lots of things to talk about today. I hope this has been of some use and interest. more from me soon. Remember, you can find all our videos, including all of my indie videos, Duran and my videos on Locals, Rumble, Odyssey, and of course BitChute, and of course Telegram. And we're also now very active on Rofkin, and you can also join me on Locals every Wednesday to do live streams. I did a humongous one yesterday on Locals. These are exclusive to Locals. You can ask me any questions and I will either cover them on the live stream itself or in follow-up programs, all of which, by the way, appear exclusively on Locals. And you can also support us via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. You can also you should also check out our shop. The amazing things that you will find there are magic mugs, hats, hoods, t-shirts, sweatshirts, and all the rest. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to press the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Well, thank you for joining me again today. Apologies if this video has been a bit long, but as I said, complex subjects to discuss. More from me soon, and have a very good day.